One man steals a loaf of bread, and an entire village is burned to the ground. No trial, no second chances, just fire, exile, and silence. This wasn't a myth. It was justice, at least by medieval standards. But why would entire communities be punished for the actions of a single person? What kind of fear held people together or tore them apart when guilt became a shared burden? This is not just a story of crime and punishment. It's a forgotten doctrine that ruled with fire, chains, and collective shame. In early human societies, law was not written, it was remembered, and it was not enforced by institutions, but by the people themselves. In tribal communities, when a man killed, stole, or dishonored another, the response didn't target just the individual. His kin, clan, or village were considered equally responsible. Punishment was not a matter of private justice, but public restoration. What mattered was not who committed the act, but which group had allowed it to happen. This logic formed the bedrock of collective punishment. Among the Germanic tribes of early Europe, justice was communal. Feuds were not between individuals but between families. If one member of a tribe injured another from a different group, retaliation was expected. If the original offender could not be found or punished, someone else from his kin could pay the price. The aim wasn't fairness in the modern sense. It was deterrence and balance. Blood was answered with blood. A wrong left unanswered could unravel social cohesion. When the Roman Empire expanded across Europe, it introduced a more codified legal structure, but the concept of collective responsibility remained embedded in practice. Entire communities were sometimes fined, exiled, or enslaved for harboring rebels or defying imperial authority. After the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Rome not only crushed the Jewish revolt, but imposed a punitive tax on all Jews across the empire, regardless of their involvement. It was not about identifying individual culprits. It was about collective submission. As the Roman state gave way to feudal kingdoms, justice grew more fragmented, but the principle endured. Lords were responsible for the conduct of their peasants. A crime committed by one serf could bring retribution upon the estate. Villagers were taxed or punished if they failed to produce an offender or assist in an investigation. This was formalized in legal systems, like the Frank Pledge in England, where groups of 10 households, known as tithings, were bound by law to guarantee the good behavior of their members. If one fled after committing a crime, the rest were held accountable. Behind this structure was a shared logic. Social order was more fragile than it appeared. In a world without central police forces or fast communication, law depended on pressure from within. If a village knew it would suffer for the misconduct of one of its own, it had every reason to regulate itself. Gossip, surveillance, and collective fear became instruments of enforcement. The group's survival mattered more than the rights of any individual. This wasn't only a tool of power. It was a reflection of how identity worked. A person wasn't seen as separate from their lineage or community. One's honor or shame was inherited. A father's debt was his son's burden. A brother's crime could define a family for generations. The collective was the unit of responsibility, and the individual merely its face. Over time, this system would be challenged by the rise of common law, centralized monarchies, and eventually Enlightenment ideas about individual rights. But for centuries, the idea that many should suffer for the one remained a central tool of justice and control. In the average medieval village, life moved to the rhythm of the land. Seasons dictated labor. The church marked time, and nearly every soul within a mile radius knew each other by name, blood, or reputation. These were closed systems, compact, self-reliant, and under constant scrutiny from within. Authority was distant. Kings ruled from castles many days' ride away. Local lords might pass through to collect rents or assert control, but day-to-day law enforcement fell to the villagers themselves. There were no permanent police, no uniformed sheriffs patrolling boundaries. Justice was decentralized, informal, communal, and often unforgiving. When a crime occurred, the village felt it like a wound. If a thief struck during the night and a sheep vanished, it wasn't just the owner who suffered. Suspicion poisoned every conversation. The reeve, usually a peasant appointed by the lord, was responsible for maintaining order, but he had few tools at his disposal. Guilt, in such cases, wasn't proven. It was assigned, and more often than not, it was shared. Theft was common, but other accusations carried deeper consequences. Heresy, for instance, invited not just earthly punishment, but divine wrath. In 14th century Languedoc, where Cathar beliefs had once flourished, even a whispered association with heretical ideas could lead to collective sanctions. Villages suspected of sheltering heretics were placed under interdict, a spiritual punishment that halted church services, baptisms, and burials. The dead were left unburied, the living unshriven. The entire community was held hostage to the actions or beliefs of a few. Harboring fugitives was another dangerous gamble. In 13th century England, royal writs empowered sheriffs to demand the surrender of criminals on the run. If a village failed to deliver, it could be fined heavily. In some regions, if a murdered man's body was discovered and the killer was not produced, the local hundred, a jurisdictional grouping of villages, was collectively liable to pay murdram, a heavy fine originally imposed by the Normans to suppress local rebellion. Even centuries later, the logic remained. If you could not control your own, you would all pay the price. The feudal village was not just a social unit, it was a legal organism. Each member's behavior reflected on the whole. Guilt traveled through bloodlines, property lines, and rumor. Collective punishment wasn't seen as injustice, it was survival policy. Villagers were expected to regulate one another. Silence was complicity. Hospitality could be treason, and when the church bell tolled whether to raise alarm or call for judgment, it echoed through every corner of the community. It summoned not just individuals, but the entire body of the village to witness, to decide, or to suffer together. In that sound was a reminder. Here, justice belonged to the group, and the group would bear its weight by the late 10th century in England. Law enforcement wasn't centralized, it was embedded into the fabric of rural life. At the heart of this system was a structure called the tithing. 10 adult males, often neighbors or extended kin, were grouped together and held mutually responsible for each other's conduct. If one of them broke the law or refused to appear before a local court, the others were legally bound to bring him forward. If they failed, they faced collective penalties. This wasn't a matter of trust, it was law. Under the Assize of Clarendon in 1166, King Henry II codified and expanded these expectations. Justice would no longer rely solely on baronial courts or royal officers. Instead, entire communities were deputized. The presumption was clear. If someone in your group committed a crime and escaped justice, you were either helping him or not trying hard enough to stop him. The tithing man, usually the eldest or most prominent in the group, had to report any criminal behavior or suspicious activity. Failure to do so could result in fines or worse. It forced every man to become part spy, part jailer. In theory, this created a community bound by order and mutual accountability. In practice, it turned villages into webs of tension and surveillance. And then there was the hue and cry, a legal obligation that extended beyond the tithing. If a crime, such as theft or assault, was witnessed, it had to be immediately shouted aloud. The entire community was then required to join the pursuit of the suspect. This wasn't optional. Anyone who heard the hue and cry and failed to join the chase could themselves be punished. It was a system built on urgency, spectacle, and fear. When the call rang out, often the literal ringing of a bell, or someone yelling through the fields, farmers dropped tools, markets emptied, and villagers sprinted after the accused. If the fugitive wasn't caught and brought to justice, the blame didn't fall solely on the one who ran. It was shared by everyone who failed to act. This turned ordinary people into frontline enforcers, but it also placed them in impossible positions. If a neighbor stole to survive, speaking out meant betrayal. Remaining silent meant risk. In some cases, communities chose to protect their own, forging unspoken pacts of silence, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Over time, these obligations hardened into formal expectations. Entire villages could be fined if they failed to raise the hue and cry. And in cases of murder, if no one came forward or helped track the killer, the entire 100, a larger administrative grouping, might be financially penalized. The logic behind it was brutally simple. If every man is his brother's keeper, then no crime should go unanswered. But the cost of that logic was the erosion of trust, the spread of suspicion, and a landscape where fear maintained order better than law. In 1069, in the north of England, a single rebellion triggered one of the most brutal campaigns of collective punishment in medieval European history, following an uprising in York, supported by Danish forces and local Anglo-Saxon nobles. William the Conqueror responded, not with targeted arrests, but with fire. Over the winter of 1069 to 1070, he ordered the harrying of the north, a systematic destruction of villages, crops, livestock, and food stores from Durham to the River Humber. His goal wasn't just to crush resistance, it was to make survival impossible. Chroniclers, like Orderic Vitalis, claimed that over 100,000 people may have died, not because they were rebels, but because they lived near them. This was the logic of the crown. If one community harbored disloyalty, the whole region would feel the punishment. It wasn't just retribution. It was a warning, brutal, visible, unforgettable. 2 centuries later, in 1322, the village of Boroughbridge in Yorkshire became the stage for another crackdown. After the execution of Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, for leading a baronial revolt against Edward II, villagers thought to have aided rebel forces were fined, garrisoned, or stripped of privileges. In some cases, towns that did nothing more than allow rebels to pass through were treated as collaborators. In the medieval mind, proximity was complicity. In Wales and Ireland, the practice became routine. English kings, trying to maintain control over native populations, frequently punished entire clans or settlements for refusing to hand over outlaws. Under Edward I's conquest of Wales, local leaders were held accountable for the actions of their men, and when those men vanished, collective reprisals followed. Livestock seized, homes burned, hostages taken. The same principle extended into religious conflict. During the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, launched by Pope Innocent III in 1209 to eliminate Cathar heresy, entire towns were massacred for harboring heretics. In Béziers, the Crusaders were famously instructed by papal legate Amalric to kill indiscriminately. "Kill them all," he said. "God will know his own." The town was set ablaze. Between 10,000 and 20,000 people were slaughtered, not because they were all heretics, but because some of them were. The Inquisition, too, followed the logic of collective consequence. In regions like Aragon and Castile, if a household was found to contain heretical texts, or if a family member confessed under pressure, entire lineages could be interrogated, property seized, and social status destroyed. Even those who recanted were marked for life, their descendants tainted by suspicion. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were policy rationalized as necessary for preserving the state, defending the faith, or protecting royal authority. Collective punishment saved the crown the burden of precise investigation. It was faster, cheaper, and more terrifying. By punishing many for the crimes of a few, rulers reshaped entire landscapes of loyalty. They made collaboration too dangerous, silence too risky, and rebellion too costly. The message was clear: you will police your own, or you will burn with them. In medieval Europe, justice was not confined to earthly courts. It extended into the unseen, into the realm of divine judgment. For the Church, sin was never a private matter. One person's heresy, one hidden transgression, could invite catastrophe upon an entire community. Droughts, plagues, military defeat, all could be interpreted as signs of divine punishment, triggered not by armies or fate, but by the unchecked spiritual corruption of a few. This belief was rooted in theology as much as fear. According to Christian doctrine, especially as shaped by St. Augustine and later medieval theologians, the Church was a mystical body, unified, indivisible. What stained one part infected the whole. The idea drew from biblical precedents. In the book of Joshua, the sin of Achan led to Israel's military failure. His entire family was stoned and burned. Medieval clergy did not see that story as metaphor. They saw it as legal precedent. By the 11th century, church leaders began to act accordingly. In Ealing-R-R at Orleans, the first recorded burning of heretics in Western Europe took place. Several members of the clergy were accused of practicing heresy in secret, rejecting sacraments and church authority. Though only a small group, the entire town was placed under scrutiny. The accused were burned publicly. Their teachings were declared so dangerous that local officials were warned. Any future tolerance would be punished with interdict. The interdict was one of the Church's most powerful tools. Unlike excommunication, which targeted individuals, the interdict suspended all sacraments across a town, region, or even entire kingdom. No weddings, no burials, no baptisms. The spiritual life of the community froze. It was collective suffocation, justified on the grounds that the innocent had failed to stop the guilty. In 1208, Pope Innocent III placed England under interdict after King John rejected the Pope's appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. For 6 years, the kingdom lived without sanctioned religious rites, not because of the actions of thousands, but because of one king's defiance. Inquisitorial procedures built upon this logic. By the 13th century, the Church had institutionalized investigation and punishment of heresy through the Inquisition. In towns like Montaigu in southern France, entire communities were questioned for harboring Cathars, a sect considered dangerously heretical. If one person confessed, others were implicated by association. Families were torn apart, property was seized, generations carried the stigma. It was not enough to repent. The stain had to be removed from the body of Christ, even if it meant cutting out whole sections. This system gave religious authorities immense power, not just over faith, but over survival. In a world where salvation was communal and wrath could fall from heaven, silence became risk, and suspicion became evidence. A village that failed to root out heresy could find itself exiled from the church and from hope itself. The fear wasn't just of torture or fire. It was of abandonment. By God, in this atmosphere, collective punishment wasn't a breakdown of justice. It was its fulfillment, a divine order in which the soul of the community mattered more than the innocence of any individual in the north of Iceland. Near the cold waters of Ejefjamar, the trading post of Gasir once thrived. By the 13th century, it had become a seasonal hub for merchants, chieftains, and farmers, a narrow strip of land where commerce and kinship intertwined. But beneath the flow of wool, fish, and imported goods ran older forces, blood ties, feuds, and the unforgiving codes of honor that governed Icelandic society. The Icelandic GRGs, law codes, made no room for centralized policing. Justice was personal. If a man was wronged, his livestock stolen, his kin killed, it was not the state that acted. It was his family. And in Gasir, one such act set off a chain of events that would tear through generations, around the mid-1200s. As recorded in fragments of the Sturlunga saga, a man from a prominent family was killed in a dispute involving trade and land rights. The slaying wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't clean. It was vengeance dressed as justice, taken without court ruling or assembly sanction. The victim's kin demanded compensation, but the killer's family refused to pay the full legal price of blood. Honor demanded retaliation. The feud escalated. Relatives of the slain retaliated with fire. A homestead was burned. Livestock taken. Then came a counterattack at a summer market in Gasir. Tents slashed. Goods destroyed. Bystanders injured. Traders, who had nothing to do with the blood feud, were drawn in, forced to take sides or suffer loss. What began as a targeted act became a spreading fire. By the time the regional thing, the legal assembly, intervened, it was no longer a dispute between families. It had destabilized the region's trade, endangered chieftain alliances, and pulled innocent households into exile. Several families were outlawed, stripped of protection under Icelandic law. Their properties were seized, children sent away, entire farms abandoned. Gasir's brief reputation as a neutral ground had collapsed under the weight of unchecked vengeance. In medieval Iceland, exile was not merely physical, it was spiritual and social erasure. An outlaw could be killed without consequence. Those who aided him shared his fate. Communities that allowed feuds to spiral became suspect themselves, punished not by decree, but by collective loss of trust, trade, and security. The Gasir feud is rarely retold. It left no grand monument, no royal edict, no climactic battle, just emptied homes, scorched turf, and a lesson recorded in silence. In a society where law is shared and honor is everything, a single act can unravel an entire village. In 1563, Scotland passed the Witchcraft Act. It wasn't a symbolic measure. It gave legal weight to a growing fear that Satan walked among ordinary people in disguise, often through the hands of women. The result wasn't a crackdown on isolated criminals. It was the birth of a system where suspicion alone could consume entire communities. The panic spread quickly. One accusation was rarely the end. It was the start of a chain reaction. If a woman was seen muttering to herself near a sick animal, or if a neighbor's child fell ill after an argument, that was enough to begin. Under pressure, the accused often named others, not out of malice, but to stop the torture. In doing so, they widened the net. Friends, neighbors, and even relatives were dragged in. In Germany, this hysteria took on industrial scale. The and Bamberg witch trials of the 1620s and 1630s remain two of the most devastating in European history. In Würzburg alone, nearly 900 people were executed over the span of a few years. They were not just elderly women or outsiders. Among them were children, priests, city council members, and even a prince-bishop's secretary. Once a town was accused of harboring witches. Its institutions followed procedure: interrogations, forced confessions, executions. The idea was not to root out a specific person, but to purify the whole. In Scotland, the Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1597 produced a similar pattern. Over 400 people were accused across the lowlands in just 1 year. The machinery was simple. Local ministers and landowners took testimonies, often spurred by sermons or suspicious deaths. Women with healing knowledge, those who lived alone or those with personal disputes, were among the first to be reported. Once convicted, their punishment wasn't private. Burning at the stake was public, meant to show that the community had rid itself of evil. But in ridding themselves of so-called evil, these communities destroyed themselves. The fear fractured villages, turning kin against each other. In places like North Berwick, the confessions of accused witches, often obtained under torture, implicated dozens more. Allegations spiraled into claims of nighttime sabbats, weather manipulation, even plots against the king. None of it was proven. All of it was prosecuted. The collective nature of these witch hunts wasn't incidental, it was structural, legal. Frameworks allowed for collective testimony. Towns that failed to prosecute suspected witches could themselves be charged with tolerating heresy. This made silence dangerous. Reporting someone, even with flimsy evidence, became a form of self-protection. Better to accuse than to be accused. Across Europe, tens of thousands were executed in the name of rooting out witchcraft. But these were not random killings. They followed procedure, backed by law, church doctrine, and public support. And they reveal a deeper truth about medieval and early modern society, when fear replaces reason. Justice can become a weapon wielded by the many against themselves. In medieval Europe, punishment was not hidden behind stone walls. It was performed on platforms, in marketplaces, and at crossroads. Public executions weren't just meant to eliminate the guilty. They were designed to control the living. Across England, France, and the German states, executions served as ritual theater. The condemned were marched through familiar streets, bound in chains or dragged in carts. They passed the homes of their neighbors, sometimes their own family, before being paraded to the place of death. There, the community gathered, not just to witness justice, but to participate in it. In towns like London and Paris, hanging was the most common method. But depending on the crime, the spectacle could be far more elaborate. Thieves might lose. Adulterers could be branded. Heretics were burned. In some regions, such as the Holy Roman Empire, Traitors were broken on the wheel, a slow, methodical execution designed to destroy the body in stages. These were not private affairs. Children were brought, markets paused, sermons were preached, as the condemned stood tied to stakes or wooden scaffolds. The stocks, pillory, and cucking stool were reserved for lesser crimes, slander, drunkenness, petty theft, but their purpose was the same. Humiliation became the punishment. A woman convicted of gossip in 14th century England might be dunked repeatedly in a freezing river, jeered at by her neighbors. A baker who sold underweight loaves could be locked in the pillory with rotten food smeared on his face. The crowd did not observe from a distance. They participated, throwing waste or insults, reinforcing not just the punishment, but their own submission to the rules. This was control through public emotion. When communities were made to cheer, mock, or weep, they became invested in the system that ruled them. Shame was contagious. By implicating the entire crowd, turning them from observers into accomplices, authorities ensured compliance without needing constant enforcement. The executions were also strategic. They took place at crossroads, near gallows hills, or just outside city gates, visible reminders of consequence. In some towns, bodies were left hanging for days, or heads placed on spikes, to reinforce the memory of the crime and the authority of those who punished it. The point wasn't just to kill or hurt. It was to create obedience by shaping emotion, to turn pain into policy, and to ensure that fear, not force, kept the peace. For centuries, collective punishment was seen not as a flaw in the system, but as its backbone. In a world without centralized police, forensic tools, or a professional judiciary, fear filled the gaps. Villages functioned through obligation and proximity. If one person broke the rules, the entire community suffered, and that threat, many argued, kept the peace. Historians examining medieval law, like Barbara Hannawalt and James Given, suggest that collective accountability was a necessary substitute for absent institutions. It created a form of localized enforcement. The tithing system in England, the blood feuds of Iceland, and the communal fines imposed across the Holy Roman Empire all relied on the same principle: make the group responsible, and they will police themselves. In some cases, it worked. Theft was discouraged when it meant your neighbor might lose his livestock. Heresy was harder to hide when silence could cost a village its sacraments. Mutual surveillance replaced formal oversight, and in isolated communities where survival depended on trust, the social pressure to conform was often stronger than royal edicts. But there's another side to that efficiency. What kept villages together was not just fear of crime, it was fear of each other. Collective punishment blurred the line between justice and intimidation. Innocence suffered not as collateral, but as design. The point was not to punish the guilty. The point was to make everyone feel responsible, and therefore controllable. Records from inquisitorial archives, local manorial courts, and royal tax rolls show how this system could spiral into cruelty. In 13th century France, entire parishes were fined for failing to report a single heretic. In 14th century England, whole hundreds paid murderum fines even when the killer was unknown. And during peasant uprisings, like the Jacquerie or the English Peasants' Revolt, retaliation was indiscriminate. Torch entire villages, hang suspected sympathizers, destroy crops, all to set an example. Critics, even in the period, questioned the fairness of this logic. Church officials like John of Salisbury warned that unjust punishment corrupted communities more than it disciplined them. Later, Enlightenment thinkers would reject collective guilt outright, laying the groundwork for modern individual rights. Still, for much of the medieval period, the fear of shared punishment held villagers together, not by building justice, but by weaponizing proximity. What looked like order from above often felt like quiet terror from below. In 2022, a classroom in Texas suspended an entire group of students for one person's prank. The official reason: no one spoke up. Silence was treated as guilt. Across the world, similar policies exist in schools, militaries, prisons, and even state diplomacy. The logic hasn't changed. When order is threatened and culprits are unclear, the group is made to pay. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, critics of Israeli policy have described the blockade of Gaza and retaliatory airstrikes as forms of collective punishment. United Nations officials have raised concerns that entire civilian populations are being penalized for the actions of militant factions. The intent may be deterrence, but the outcome mirrors patterns seen centuries ago. Punish broadly to prevent resistance locally in North Korea. The Yan JWAG system institutionalizes guilt by association. If one person is found guilty of political dissent, their entire family, sometimes for 3 generations, may be imprisoned or executed. This policy, while extreme, echoes the medieval belief that disloyalty is hereditary and loyalty must be enforced through fear. Even in Western democracies, economic sanctions often target entire nations. In the 1990s, the UN sanctions against Iraq aimed to pressure Saddam Hussein's regime but resulted in severe hardship for civilians, including food shortages and medicine scarcity. Today, sanctions against countries like Iran and Venezuela continue to raise ethical questions. When the government is the target, but the people bear the cost, where does justice end and collective punishment begin? The psychological roots trace directly to the medieval period. The belief that one person's sin corrupts the group, that silence implies complicity, and that fear ensures order. These ideas remain embedded in institutional logic. From military units enforcing group discipline to corporations penalizing entire teams for internal leaks. The mechanisms may look modern, but the mindset is centuries old. Collective punishment persists not because it is just, but because it is efficient. It shifts responsibility from the state to the people. It demands conformity without needing constant surveillance. And it enforces obedience by reminding everyone what they stand to lose. What medieval rulers imposed through gallows and fines, modern systems achieve with policy and law. The methods have evolved, the reasoning has not. In the end, the same question echoes through time. When one breaks the rules, how far should the consequences reach? And how much of that reach still defines the way we live today?